Okay, I'm going to spend a few minutes recapping our class on Friday, which was not very well attended. Yes, because it was Good Friday and all that. But what we did was we learned what money was. So we learned the definition of money. We learned significantly that money is not the same thing, is not equal to income or wealth, because these existed even before money was invented. There was a time in human history when money hadn't been invented, but you still had wealth and you still had income. Only income and wealth took the form of commodities of some sort. If you were a farmer, your income took the form of your crop. Your wealth would take the form of land, homes, heads of sheep, heads of cattle, things of that nature. Correct? So money is not the same thing as income and wealth. It just so happens that we use money as a so-called unit of account in modern times. We use money to measure income, wealth, and a host of other economic financial entities like profit, loss, cost, price, etc. I gave you a brief history in class last time on the origins of currency and also the origins of the banking system. So what we learned was that the first currency were goldsmith receipts. If you weren't in class on Friday, you might listen to the integrity recording of that class. Okay? So we learned that the first paper money was goldsmith receipts, and the first banks were in fact goldsmiths. Right, so going back to our PowerPoint lecture now, this was the last slide that we covered. And here we were looking at some desired physical properties that the object money ought to possess. See, humans have always chosen things to be money that had certain qualities. And these are the desirable properties of that commodity money, this human invention money. It has to be portable, ideally, because you want to carry it around in order for it to serve as a medium of exchange. In other words, you have to be able to carry it with you to the marketplace, to go shopping with. Second, you'd like it to be divisible. Otherwise, a simple problem would arise. How would somebody make change for you? Correct? So money has to be divisible into small units. And it has to be durable as well. It can't be something that spoils quickly, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to be a store of value. People wouldn't be able to accumulate wealth in the form of money. Now we're going to jump into the modern economy. And we are going to define the certain official measures, what's called the nation's money supply. So this is a term that we are now going to see quite a lot of. The money supply. We will learn that the Fed, or the Federal Reserve System, has a lot to do with the money supply. Their actions, in fact, affect the money supply. So what is the money supply of the nation? Now do remember that the money supply is simply a count of the units of money in the economy, this human invention. Right? I might as well count up the total number of ballpoint pens in our economy, ballpoint pens being a human invention also. Correct? So a nation's money supply has nothing directly to do with national income or well-being or GDP. Do you follow me? A country with a high money supply is not a prosperous country. Right? All we're doing is we're counting up the number of units of this human invention money floating around in the economy. Do you follow me? I might as well be counting the number of baseball caps in the economy, which is also another human invention. Right? So what is the money supply? Here we have these two definitions, M1, and this is often called the narrow definition. And by the narrow definition of money, money M1 consists of all currency with the public. So this would include all the money that's lying in our pockets, for instance, by which I mean all currency notes as well as coins. So that's the first component of the nation's money supply according to the narrow definition, or M1. The second component is called traveler's checks. Now this is something that you may not be familiar with. They were much more popular in the past, but this is one way of basically making sure that you don't lose your money when you're traveling. Okay, so let me quickly explain to you what traveler's checks are in case you haven't seen one. Let's say that you were traveling abroad, and of course you needed to carry dollars with you, but if you carried a lot of cash with you, there was a risk that you might lose this money. So before going on your journey, you would go to your local bank and you would buy from them traveler's checks. So you would pay them, say, $500 cash, and they would give you a little less than $500 worth of traveler's checks, a little less because they would take a small fee, they would charge you a small fee. So the traveler's check is a piece of paper like this. Typically, they were American Express traveler's checks. There was a dollar figure, let's say $100 written on it, right? It wasn't money, it was just a piece of paper. It looks like a small certificate of sorts. Now, there were two lines here for signatures. So this is what the bank made you do. When you bought the checks from them, they would have you sign on one of those lines, in front of them, that is. Correct? Now, you took this traveler's check with you, and if you lost it, that's fine. All you had to do was report the number. Each one had a serial number. So you had to report the serial number to your bank, and they would refund you the money, because no one else could use it. Why could no one else use it? Because every time you go to a store, let's say in London, to pay for something, and you offered a traveler's check, you would have to sign once again on that second line in front of the cashier there. And the two signatures would have to match. Only then would the cashier there accept this traveler's check. So if you lost it, there was no risk of anyone else using it, you see? Do you follow? So these are traveler's checks. And traveler's checks, which are not very popular these days because we all pretty much use our credit cards wherever you go, these days. But traveler's checks are our second component of M1. And the third component of M1, which is really the critical component here, is called checkable deposits, owned by individuals and businesses. Checkable deposits. Now, what are checkable deposits? These are deposits in financial institutions against which checks may be written. So typically then these would be your checking account. This would be your money in your checking account. This is typically what you write checks against. But checking account deposits are not the only kind of checkable deposits. There are other kinds of deposits in other kinds of institutions besides banks, that is. Credit unions, for instance, have their own sets of deposits against which you can write checks. Okay? So this is what M1 consists of. Now, what's the logic of counting these three things as part of the nation's money supply? Why is cash considered part of the nation's money supply? because you can use it to buy things. Am I correct? What about traveler's checks? That too, you can use traveler's checks to buy goods and services. And money in your checking account is also considered part of the nation's money supply because lots of people buy things using checks. They write checks. Is that correct? M2 is a slightly broader definition of the money supply. M2 includes M1, but it also includes certain other deposits. It includes savings deposits, small time deposits. Now, what are time deposits? Time deposits are like CDs. It's money that you put in a bank and you assure the bank that you will not withdraw the money for a specified period of time, like 6 months. Correct? So this is money that you deposit, but you can't really withdraw it for a specified period of time. If you do, there will be penalties. Right? So these are called time deposits. Money market funds. This is typically money that you have used to buy US government treasury bills, which are kind of like bonds, only short term. Money market funds. And some other deposits. So M2 broadens the definition of the money supply. It includes M1 plus these other deposits. Okay? Now, before we proceed, I'm going to ask you a few questions to make sure we understand exactly what qualifies as money and what doesn't. Okay? Let's consider credit cards. Are credit cards money? We can buy things with them. So would that qualify as money? What would you say? When you use a credit card, what exactly are you doing? You are borrowing, are you not? Correct? So what you are doing is you are borrowing someone else's money. Do you follow me? The bank has lent you money which belongs really to somebody else. That's what banks do. They take deposits from other people and then lend that money out to yet other people. Am I correct? So, borrowing isn't money. What is money is that other person's checkable deposit from which this borrowing has come. But the credit card itself isn't money. Do you follow me? What about checks? The checks in your checkbook. Now, they themselves aren't money. But what lies behind them is money. You write them against money in your checking account. Is that correct? So money in your checking account, well, that's money, but the checks themselves are not money. Am I making sense? And this gives you a sense of M1 and M2 in perspective. These are figures that are slightly dated. I believe they come from perhaps the year 2011, if I'm not mistaken. But even so, you have a sense of what the size of M1 is. M1, a few years ago, was equal to so many $1 billion. Almost $2,000 billion, $2 trillion. That's the size of M1, the nation's M1. Of this, the biggest item seems to be checkable deposits, 977 billion. Slightly smaller than that was currency held by individual and businesses and traveler's checks. Traveler's checks are really a tiny amount. They are really the smallest component of the money supply. So checkable deposits are really the biggest component of the nation's money supply. Okay? Of course, when you add savings, deposits, and everything else, then your money supply is much bigger. It's about $9 trillion by M2. Okay? So what, again, are we doing with M1 and M2? We are just simply counting up the units of money in the economy. So this has nothing directly to do with how well off we are. A nation with a high money supply is not one that is necessarily better off. All we're doing is we're counting the units of money, this human invention, that are floating around in the economy. What determines how well off we are? Can somebody answer that? I just said that the nation's money supply does not determine how well off we Americans are. So what determines how well off we are? Anyone have an answer to that? 3-letter acronym. That determines how well off we are. Oh, I'm going to add another word in front of this. Do you follow me? That is a measure of how well off we are, because this is a measure of the value of goods and services produced in our economy. And all of this really, so this is part of the nation's output, but it is also the income of households by our circular flow of income idea. Is that correct? And that determines how well off we are. So our well-being is not determined by our money supply. Our well-being is determined by our GDP. And GDP is something that existed. It wasn't measured, of course, but it did exist even before the invention of money. Do you follow me? If you look at a primitive economy in prehistory, well, this economy had GDP. People were producing things, final goods and services. Is that correct? Of course, no one measured it back then, but it did exist. Right? It says here, the test of whether something is money is whether it is generally accepted as a means of payment. In other words, something that you can go shopping with. That's our definition of money. M1 passes this test and is money. Is that correct? Cash, you can buy things with. Traveler's checks, you can buy things with. And money in your checking account, you can buy things with by writing checks. Correct? Some savings deposits in M2 are just as much a means of payment as the checkable deposit in M1. You see, money in savings is almost like M1 in the sense you can quickly transfer it from saving to checking and then go shopping with it. So it's almost as good as M1. Correct? Other savings deposits, time deposits, and money market funds are not instantly convertible and are not a means of payment. So if you have a CD, for instance, a 6-month CD, you can't buy something with it. Is that correct? It's not instantly convertible into something that you can buy things with. So that isn't, strictly speaking, money there. It's not part of M1. Right? Stuff we discussed just now. It says here, a credit card isn't money. It's a means of borrowing. A debit card. What about a debit card? Well, that too isn't money, but what lies behind the debit card? Money in your checking account. Well, that's money. So a debit card is kind of like a check. Right? It says here, a check isn't money either. It is an instruction to a bank to make a payment. On the other hand, the checkable deposit upon which the check is drawn is money. And now we come to the banking system. And our nation's banking system consists of these two components. We have the Federal Reserve, or the Fed. And then we have banks and other institutions that accept deposits and that provide the services that enable people and businesses to make and receive payments. So this would then be banks and other financial institutions that accept deposits. Remember, it has to be a financial institution that accepts customer deposits. Now, what about an investment bank? Do you know what an investment bank is? Wall Street, for instance, is full of investment banks. Now, these are financial institutions, all right, but we don't count them here because they don't accept customer deposits. They are engaged in basically providing financial services to firms. You follow me? So this is a nice little schematic diagram that shows us what the banking system is. We have the Fed on top. The Fed regulates. The Fed regulates the banking system. So you have the Fed on top, and then you have these various kinds of financial institutions here. Commercial banks, well, that's, I guess, what we're all familiar with. Banks that we deposit our money in typically. Banks like IBC and Chase and so on. Then you have thrift institutions. These are typically your credit unions. Some people deposit their money in credit unions. And then you have these money market funds. And these are basically institutions that will use your money to buy treasury bills. Right? And then we will shortly learn that the actions of these financial institutions actually determines the nation's money supply. So the nation's money supply is in fact determined by the banking system. And this is something that we will shortly learn, just how the banking system can affect the nation's money supply. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is, instead of getting into these details, now we have definitions here of commercial banks, etc. Okay. I am now going to launch into a certain story. But to do that, I'm going to get out of this PowerPoint and go to my drawing board. Okay? So we're going to look at the banking system. Or rather, how the banking system creates money. This is what we're going to spend the rest of our class doing. Okay? How the banking system creates money. And my story will have some parts that may seem unclear to you right now, but it will become clearer as we proceed. Okay? Now I start my story as follows. I start my story with the following statement: I own a government bond. Now we have heard of this term before, right? Government bonds. In what context did we last hear this term? When we spoke of the government running budget deficits. When the government spends more than it collects in taxes, what must it do? It must borrow. Is that correct? When the government spends more than it collects in taxes, the government must borrow. And how does the government borrow? The government borrows by selling bonds. Now, I happen to be a person who owns such a government bond. In other words, I have lent the government money in the past. Correct? Now, let us say that I wish to sell this bond today. Now, I can wait for the date of maturity of the bond to come around. Let me explain that. A bond, if you recall, is again a piece of paper like this. It has two bits of information on it. It has a dollar face value, which is a dollar value printed on the bond. For instance, the face value may be $1,000. The other bit of information on it is a date. It's called the date of maturity. So what is this piece of paper? It's a promise by the government that it will pay you, the owner of this bond, $1,000 on the date of maturity or at any time after that. Correct? So I own this piece of paper. Now let's say the date of maturity is 1 year away. So there's 1 year, the date of maturity is a year away. So I would have to wait a whole year for the government to pay me this $1,000. Is that correct? Because the government will only pay me this money on the date of maturity or at any time after that. But let's say that I need money now. Let's say that I have some sort of emergency and I need to sell some of my assets. Correct? And this is an asset of mine. Is that correct? This is a valuable piece of paper because this paper will give me $1,000 at the end of a year. So this paper has value, right? Just as my watch may have value or my car may have value. And if I'm in financial trouble, I may decide to sell these things. Am I correct? I could therefore even sell this piece of paper, right? So I decide to sell this paper today, this bond, and I sell it to the Fed. Now this may seem strange to you. You may ask, what's the Fed doing buying my bond? Is the Fed in the business of buying bonds? Well, here I'm just simply going to tell you that depending on the Fed's policies, sometimes it buys bonds, sometimes it sells them. That's all I'm going to say for now, okay? So what am I saying? Sometimes the Fed buys bonds. At other times, it sells them. So let's say that on this particular day, the Fed is buying bonds. So I take my government bond and I sell it to the Fed. Okay? How much will I get from the Fed for it? Will I get $1,000 for it? $1,000 being the face value of the bond. Will anyone pay me $1,000 for this bond today? But whoever buys this bond will have to wait a whole year to get $1,000 from the government. So clearly no one will pay me $1,000 for it today, something less than that. Am I correct? But to keep things simple, let me just say this. Let me put the face value at something bigger than 1,000, okay? So let's say that I modify this slightly, and I make this not 1,000, but I make it 1,050, and I sell this bond to the Fed for 1,000, which is less than the face value, correct? I'm going to have to sell it for less than face value because whoever possesses the bond will only get the face value at the end of a year. So that person will have to be compensated for waiting. Am I making sense? So I sell my bond to the Fed for $1,000. Now let us look at what's going to happen to the nation's money supply. And I'm going to use the symbol MS for money supply. And I'm going to use the M1 definition. Okay? So what happens to the nation's money supply now? Change in the nation's money supply. Can we calculate that? Now do remember what M1 is. What does M1 consist of? Anyone recall? M1 consists of three things. What are they? Cash with the public. Next. Checkable deposits of the public, of course. And lastly, traveler's checks with the public. So when the Fed buys my bond for $1,000 cash, what happens to this M1 here? Which of these three components changes? Which of these three components changes? Well, I am part of the public, am I not? Right? So wouldn't the cash with the public part go up? Yes? Go up by how much? $1,000, isn't it? So right away, the money supply changes, goes up by $1,000. Right? So what have we learned here? We've learned that when the Fed buys bonds from people like me, the money supply goes up by $1,000 right away. In this case, the money that the Fed pays me for my bond. But the story doesn't end there. Because what I do right away with money, with a sum like that, as large as that, is I usually deposit this. I usually deposit this in my checking account. Is that correct? When I deposit it with my checking account, what happens to M1 at that point? Well, cash with the public goes back down to what it was, but checkable deposits now go up by the 1,000. Is that correct? So when we look at the change in the money supply, it's still plus 1,000. Only the form has changed. This has gone from cash to checkable deposits, but it's still up by 1,000. Is that correct? Right? Now the banking system comes in, which is why I've said that the banking system affects the supply of money. And how does the banking system affect the supply of money? I am now going to draw here what's called a T account. Of my bank. And what does a T account look like? It looks like this. On one side, we have assets. On the other side, we have what are called liabilities. I'm not an accountant, but this is quite simple to understand. Liabilities basically are monies that the company or the firm owes others. Right? So customer deposits of a bank would appear on which side? Assets or liabilities? Would that be the assets of the bank? When I deposit money in my bank, isn't that money the bank now owes me? So it would be part of the liability side. Am I correct? This is money the bank owes its customers, right? So deposits will be here then. And let's say that this bank has at the present time $10,000 of customer deposits. Right? Now what does it do with this money? Well, if all of it was in cash form in the bank's vault, then this entire 10,000 would appear on the asset side as cash reserves. Cash reserves would be equal to exactly 10,000 if all of this money, customers' money, was simply kept in cash form in the bank's vault. But that, of course, is not something the bank will do. The bank will try to make some interest income off this $10,000, other people's money. Is that correct? I'm now going to define something called the required reserve ratio, or the RRR. Now, what is the required reserve ratio? This is the minimum percentage of deposits that a bank is required to keep as a cash reserve. Required by whom? Required by the Fed. The Fed requires banks to keep a minimum percentage of their deposits as a cash reserve. Now, why does the Fed insist upon this? In other words, what the Fed says is that banks may not lend out the full $10,000 to other people. Now, why does the Fed insist upon this? Because if my bank lent out all its customers' deposits to other people, and if I came along and wanted to make a large cash withdrawal, the bank wouldn't have money to pay me because all my money has been lent to somebody else. Now, if that were to happen, wouldn't that make me lose confidence in this bank? Am I correct? Now, to prevent something like this from happening, the Fed insists that banks keep a minimum percentage of their deposits as a cash reserve. And this RRR, for instance, may be a figure like e.g. 10%. 10% is actually very large. It's unusually high. It's usually much smaller than that. But we're going to work with a number like 10%. So assuming that my bank keeps exactly 10% and no more of this 10,000 deposits as a cash reserve, what would the size of my bank's cash reserves be? What's 10% of 10,000? 1,000. So that's the cash reserves, the required cash reserves that this bank must keep. And what happens to the remaining 9,000 then? It is lent out. So loans is part of the assets of banks because this is money that others owe the bank. So this is what a bank's T account looks like. Am I making sense here? Now, some of this may be unfamiliar to you, but are you grasping the essentials? So we have here customers' deposits, $10,000 in this bank. This bank is required by law to hold at least 10% of this 10,000 as a cash reserve. This is to ensure that when customers come to make withdrawals, the bank always has some cash on hand to pay out. Because if you go to the bank to make a withdrawal and the bank tells you, I'm sorry, we don't have any money, you are going to start to panic. Am I correct? So to prevent this from happening, the Fed requires all banks to keep a certain minimum percentage of their customers' deposits as cash. So that's the cash reserve part. The rest, the bank lends out to other people. And the money that it lends out becomes the bank's assets, because this is money that others owe the bank. Correct? So what are liabilities then? Liabilities are monies that the bank owes others, and the bank owes customers like me money, because I have deposited money in the bank. In a sense, I have lent my money to the bank. So that would be part of the liabilities of banks. Is that correct? So this is what my bank's T account looks like. Before I sold my bond to the Fed for $1,000 cash, which I then deposit in my bank. So when I make that fresh deposit of $1,000, what happens to the deposit side here? It goes up by, is that correct? What is this again? This is money that I received from the Fed for my bond, right? What's going to happen now on the liabilities, on the asset side? 1,000 fresh deposits. So I've taken 1,000 cash and deposited in my bank. So right away, this will bump up the cash reserves of my bank by 1,000. Is that correct? Now, what are total deposits at this point? Total deposits are 11,000. So how much of this is the bank supposed to keep as a cash reserve? 10%. Well, what's 10% of 11,000? 10% of 11,000 is 1,100. Is that correct? So the amount of cash that my bank has to have is 1,100 only. In other words, of this 1,000 that I have just deposited, my bank can lend out how much? Come on, tell me. All my bank needs to keep is 100 of this 1,000, which would be 10%. And the rest my bank can lend out. Does that make sense to you? So this is what the new assets and liabilities of my bank are going to look like after I make my $1,000 deposit. The $1,000 that I received from the Fed for my bond. Correct? Let's go back to our money supply situation. What's happened up to now? What's the change in the nation's money supply? It's still up by 1,000. Correct? But this is what happens now. This 900 that is now lent out, let's say that one of you has borrowed this money. Correct? You borrowed this $900 from this bank happens to be your bank also, let us say. And you have borrowed this $900 from your bank in order to buy a new computer from Best Buy, the store. Right? So you take this $900 and you go to Best Buy and you buy a computer with it. This $900 goes where? It goes first into the cash register of Best Buy. And then what happens to the money then? Well, at the end of the evening, an armored truck comes by and pretty much takes all the money in Best Buy's cash register to Best Buy's own bank. Stores have bank accounts also, you know. Am I correct? So this 900 will end up in Best Buy's bank account. So we now have to think of a little T account for Best Buy's bank. Okay? So very quickly then, we have the liability side, we have the asset side. And let's say Best Buy's bank happens to have $20,000 on deposit at the present time. The RRR, the required reserve ratio, being 10%. $2,000 are cash reserves. That's 10% of 20,000. And 18,000 are loans. Right? And now we have a fresh deposit of $900 here. The $900 you borrowed and have spent in Best Buy on a new computer. This money has ended up in Best Buy's bank account. Is that correct? What now happens to the money supply of the nation? And remember, it initially went up by 1,000, but now Best Buy's checking account has been bumped up by $900. And checkable deposits are part of the nation's money supply. So we have a further increase of $900 in the nation's money supply. Do you follow what's going on? Let me summarize this in one sentence before I stop today. It all started with the Fed buying my bond, giving me cash. I deposit this in my bank account. At that point, the money supply of the nation has gone up by $1,000. But then, my bank lends out 900 of this 1,000 to one of you. You take the money, you spend it in Best Buy. Therefore, the money then ends up in Best Buy's checking account, and this causes the sum total of the nation's checkable deposits to rise by a further 900. The 900 that your bank lent, or rather my bank lent you. Is that correct? So we have an increase up to now of $1,900. But the story doesn't end there either. And we will carry on next class. Okay?